At 2:30 a.m. on October 26, 1942, Sergeant Mitchell Paige crouched behind a Browning M1917 machine gun on a muddy ridge at Henderson Field, Guadalcanal, listening to 3,000 Japanese soldiers advancing through the jungle darkness toward his position. He had 17 Marines left. Most could barely stand. They hadn't eaten a full meal in 6 days. Half had malaria. All had dysentery. The machine gun's water jacket was leaking. They had 4 belts of ammunition remaining. Maybe 1,200 rounds between survival and death. Paige pressed his cheek against the gun's stock. The metal was slick with condensation. Through the darkness, he heard them. Voices in Japanese. Equipment rattling. Boots squelching in mud. Hundreds of boots. Maybe thousands. They were close now. Less than 50 yards. The jungle was alive with movement. His hands found the trigger grips. Behind him, Henderson Field lay silent. 2 runways. 40 aircraft. The only American airstrip within 1,000 miles. If it fell tonight, Guadalcanal fell. If Guadalcanal fell, the Pacific War changed. Paige didn't know he was about to fight the most lopsided defensive action in Marine Corps history. Mitchell Paige was 24 years old. He'd grown up in Charleroi, Pennsylvania, a coal mining town 40 miles south of Pittsburgh, where most men went underground at 16 and died underground at 50. Paige had worked the mines for 3 years after high school. He knew what it felt like to be trapped in darkness with death pressing in from all sides. That knowledge would save his life on Guadalcanal. He'd enlisted in the Marine Corps in September 1936. 6 years of peacetime service. Boot camp at Paris Island. Infantry training at Quantico. Promotion to corporal, then sergeant. He was good at what he did. Patient, detail-oriented. The kind of NCO who maintained equipment when others were sleeping and rehearsed fields of fire until every man knew every sector by memory. Paige had arrived on Guadalcanal on September 18, 1942, 5 weeks ago. He commanded a machine gun section in the 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines. 4 gun crews. 33 men originally. Now 17. The island had consumed the others. Not combat. Disease. Corporal James Tosh, age 20, from Mobile, Alabama, had died of cerebral malaria on October 3rd. Private First Class Eugene Fletcher, age 19, from Sacramento, California, had been evacuated with blackwater fever on October 9th. He'd weighed 87 pounds when they carried him to the aid station. He'd weighed 150 when he landed. The problem wasn't just malaria. Everyone had malaria. The problem was starvation. Supply ships couldn't get through. Japanese destroyers and submarines controlled the waters around Guadalcanal after dark. American ships came only during daylight. Even then, they rarely stayed long enough to unload properly. The Marines on Henderson Field were subsisting on captured Japanese rice and whatever they could scavenge from the jungle. Half a cup of rice per day, maybe some coconut, sometimes nothing. Paige's men were skeletons. Private Robert Gaston, age 22, from Lexington, Kentucky, had lost 40 pounds in 5 weeks. Private John Malone, age 21, from Boston, Massachusetts, could wrap his thumb and forefinger around his own bicep. They shook constantly from fever. Their eyes were yellow with jaundice. Their gums bled from scurvy. They had open sores that wouldn't heal and dysentery that left them dehydrated and weak, but they could still fight. Paige had made sure of that. Every morning, no matter how sick they were, they cleaned the machine guns. Every afternoon, they test-fired them. Every evening, they rehearsed sectors and range cards. The machine guns were M1917 Brownings, water-cooled, belt-fed, capable of 500 rounds per minute, accurate to 1,500 yards. The most reliable machine gun ever made. The guns worked. The men worked. That's all that mattered. On October 23rd, 3 days before the attack, Paige lost his first man to combat. Corporal Anthony Malinowski, age 23, from Detroit, Michigan. They'd been friends since Quantico. Malinowski had been a toolmaker at Ford before enlisting. He had steady hands and good eyes. Paige had made him his assistant section leader. Japanese artillery had found their position that afternoon. The bombardment lasted 30 minutes. Most of it went long. One round landed short. Malinowski had been carrying water to the gun positions. The shell exploded 6 feet behind him. Shrapnel severed his femoral artery. He bled out in 40 seconds before anyone could reach him. Paige had held pressure on the wound anyway. Malinowski's blood was hot and sticky between his fingers. It soaked through 4 field dressings before the flow stopped. When it stopped, Malinowski stopped. His eyes stayed open. Paige closed them. Then he went back to work. There wasn't time for anything else. They buried Malinowski after dark in a shallow grave marked with an upturned rifle. 2 days later, on October 25th, Private First Class Victor Cernik, age 19, from Chicago, Illinois, died during a Japanese probe. Cernik had been on Paige's gun crew for 8 months. He was the youngest, still had pimples, wrote letters to his mother every day even though mail hadn't left the island in 3 weeks. The Japanese probe came at dusk. 20 soldiers testing the American perimeter. Cernik had been in a foxhole 30 yards forward of Paige's position. He'd killed 3 Japanese soldiers with his rifle before a grenade landed in his hole. The explosion was muffled. When they pulled Cernik out after the probe ended, most of his chest was gone. Paige promoted Private Gaston to fill Cernik's position. There was no ceremony, no paperwork, just, "Gaston, you're on gun 3 now." Gaston nodded and moved. That's how it worked on Guadalcanal. Men died. Other men took their places. The machine guns kept firing. Now Paige had 17 men. 17 starving, sick, exhausted Marines who'd been holding this ridge for 5 weeks against an enemy that outnumbered them and wanted Henderson Field more than anything else in the Pacific. Intelligence reported that 3,000 Japanese soldiers were massing in the jungle. 3,000 against 17. The math was simple and impossible, but Paige had 4 machine guns, 4 Browning M1917s in carefully positioned, mutually supporting positions with interlocking fields of fire covering every approach to Henderson Field. The Japanese would have to come through those fields of fire to reach the airstrip. They would have to advance uphill through mud and kunai grass with no cover against guns that could fire 500 rounds per minute. Paige thought maybe, possibly, they could hold. For a while. Maybe. The strategic problem was simple. Henderson Field was everything. The Americans had invaded Guadalcanal on August 7th specifically to capture the airfield the Japanese were building. Whoever controlled Henderson Field controlled the airspace within a 300-mile radius. Whoever controlled the airspace controlled the seas. Whoever controlled the seas controlled Guadalcanal. Whoever controlled Guadalcanal controlled the southern Solomon Islands. Whoever controlled the Solomons controlled the sea lanes to Australia. The Japanese understood this perfectly. They'd been trying to retake Henderson Field since August. They'd sent troops, sent ships, sent aircraft. Nothing had worked. American Marines held the perimeter. American pilots flew from the runways. American supply lines stayed barely alive. So the Japanese changed tactics. Instead of piecemeal attacks, they would send everything at once. One massive assault. 3,000 soldiers from the 16th and 29th Infantry Regiments. Veterans from China and Manchuria. Experienced jungle fighters with orders to retake Henderson Field or die trying. The Americans knew they were coming. Coast watchers had reported Japanese troop movements. Patrols had spotted supply dumps being established in the jungle. Captured documents confirmed a major offensive was imminent. But knowing didn't help. The Americans didn't have enough men to defend the entire perimeter. They didn't have enough food to keep their defenders strong. They didn't have enough ammunition for a sustained battle. Division headquarters made a brutal calculation. They identified the most likely Japanese attack route, a ridge system running southeast toward Henderson Field through dense jungle. The ridge was obvious terrain. Any force attacking from that direction would use it. So headquarters positioned the 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines on that ridge. 700 men stretched across 2 miles. But disease and combat had reduced the battalion to fewer than 400 effectives. The line was thin, in some places desperately thin. Paige's section held the thinnest point, 100-yard frontage with 4 machine gun positions and 50 riflemen. No reserves, no support weapons except the machine guns. No mines or barbed wire because they didn't have any. Just riflemen in foxholes and 4 machine guns positioned to cover the approaches. Battalion headquarters was 300 yards behind them. Henderson Field was half a mile beyond that. If the Japanese broke through Paige's position, there was nothing between them and the runways except scattered service troops and pilots who'd never trained for ground combat. The water situation made everything worse. The M1917 Browning was a magnificent weapon, but it needed water. Lots of water. The barrel was surrounded by a water jacket that had to stay filled or the gun would overheat after a few hundred rounds. In sustained combat, the water boiled. It had to be replaced constantly, or the jacket would rupture and the gun would fail. Fresh water was scarce on Guadalcanal. The streams were contaminated. The only clean water came from rain or Japanese supplies. Paige's section had maybe 15 gallons of water total, enough for the guns to fire for perhaps 30 minutes of sustained combat. After that, the barrels would glow red. The mechanisms would seize. The guns would die. Ammunition was another problem. Each machine gun had a basic load of 4,000 rounds. Sounds like a lot. It isn't. At 500 rounds per minute, a single gun could empty its basic load in 8 minutes of continuous fire. In a real fight with adrenaline and fear, gunners fired in long bursts. Tracers every 5th round, beaten zones walking across target areas. Suppressive fire keeping enemy heads down. 4,000 rounds disappeared fast. Paige had trained his crews to fire in short bursts. 6 to 9 rounds. Traverse between bursts. Pick targets. Don't waste ammunition. But training and reality were different things. In combat, discipline broke down. Men held triggers. Belts fed through mechanisms. Brass casings piled up. Ammunition vanished. Paige knew that if the Japanese came in force, his guns would run dry before the attack ended. On October 24th, 2 days before the battle, Private Thomas Rigby, age 20, from Nashville, Tennessee, died proving exactly what would happen when the guns failed. Rigby had been manning an outpost position 400 yards forward of Paige's Ridge. His job was to give early warning of Japanese movements. He had a rifle, a radio, and orders to fall back if he saw anything significant. At 400 hours on the 24th, Rigby reported movement. Lots of movement. Japanese soldiers massing in the jungle. He counted more than 100. Battalion ordered him to withdraw. Rigby acknowledged. Then his radio went silent. A patrol found him at dawn. He'd made it 200 yards before they caught him. He'd killed 7 Japanese soldiers with his rifle before running out of ammunition. After that, they'd used bayonets. It had taken a long time. Rigby's body told the story. The patrol brought him back. They buried him next to Malinowski and Cernik in the growing cemetery behind Paige's position. Rigby's death confirmed what everyone already knew. The Japanese were coming. Soon. In overwhelming numbers. And when American guns ran out of ammunition, American soldiers ran out of luck. Private First Class Lawrence Plant, age 21, from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, died the next day when Japanese artillery found the supply dump where extra ammunition was stored. The dump was nothing fancy, just wooden crates stacked under camouflage netting 300 yards behind the lines. Plant had been assigned to guard it. One Japanese 75mm shell landed directly in the dump. The ammunition cooked off. Explosions rippled through the position for 10 minutes. When the smoke cleared, Plant was gone. So was most of the extra ammunition for the machine guns. Battalion scrapers together what they could from other units. Paige's section ended up with maybe 6,000 rounds total, 1,500 per gun. Enough for 3 minutes of sustained fire per gun. Maybe 4 if they were disciplined. Against 3,000 Japanese soldiers attacking uphill through jungle, 6,000 rounds was nothing. It was a joke, but it was all they had. The food situation made everything harder. Paige's men hadn't eaten properly in a week. Their last hot meal had been on October 19th. Since then, captured rice and coconuts, maybe 500 calories per day. Nowhere near enough for men digging foxholes and carrying ammunition and maintaining weapons in 100-degree heat. They were burning 3,000 calories per day and consuming 500. The deficit was cumulative and devastating. By October 25th, most of Paige's men could barely walk 100 yards without resting. They shook constantly. Their thinking was slow. Their reactions were delayed. In training, these men had been sharp. They'd been fast. They'd been professional Marine infantrymen who could shoot and move and communicate under pressure. Now they were sick and starving and operating on pure will. Paige knew the math. 17 starving men with 6,000 rounds of ammunition against 3,000 Japanese soldiers meant death. Simple, obvious, inevitable. The Japanese would attack. The Americans would fight. The ammunition would run out. The machine guns would fail. The Japanese would keep coming. Henderson Field would fall unless something changed. Unless 17 Marines could do something impossible. Unless Mitchell Paige, coal miner from Pennsylvania, could figure out how to hold a 100-yard frontage against odds that made victory mathematically absurd. He had no plan, no secret weapon, no reinforcements coming, just 4 machine guns, 17 starving Marines, and a promise to himself that the Japanese wouldn't take Henderson Field while he was alive to stop them. The final straw came at 1900 hours on October 25th. Captain Louis Ditta, Paige's company commander, visited the positions. Ditta was 32 years old, a career officer from New Jersey who'd been at Belleau Wood in the First War. He'd seen bad situations before. But Guadalcanal was breaking him. You could see it in his eyes. The weight of too many dead men, too many impossible orders. Ditta walked the line with Paige. He inspected the gun positions, checked fields of fire, counted ammunition. When they finished, he pulled Paige aside. They stood in the fading jungle twilight while mosquitoes swarmed and distant artillery rumbled. Ditta lit a cigarette with shaking hands. "They're coming tonight, Mitch," Ditta said. "Intelligence confirms it. 3 battalions. Maybe more. Straight up this ridge." Paige nodded. He'd known it was coming. Everyone had known. Ditta took a long drag. "Battalion says hold as long as possible. Then withdraw to secondary positions." "What secondary positions?" Paige asked. Ditta smiled without humor. "There aren't any. Battalion's making that up to sound better than fight until you're dead." They stood in silence. The jungle was never quiet. Birds, insects. The rustle of wind through kunai grass. Somewhere in that jungle, 3,000 Japanese soldiers were preparing to attack, eating rice, cleaning weapons, sharpening bayonets, working themselves into the mental state required to charge uphill into machine gun fire. "Can you hold?" Ditta asked finally. Paige looked at his positions. 4 machine guns, 17 men, 6,000 rounds. Impossible odds. But he thought about Malinowski and Cernik and Rigby and Plant. He thought about Henderson Field behind them. The pilots sleeping in tents. The aircraft that kept Japanese ships away during daylight. The supply lines that kept Marines barely alive. Everything depended on this ridge. "Yes, sir," Paige said. "We'll hold." Ditta studied him. "That's not an order, Mitch. You understand? If it gets bad, if they break through, you pull your men back. Don't waste lives trying to hold the impossible." "Understood, sir." But Paige knew he was lying. He knew Ditta knew he was lying. There was no pulling back, no tactical withdrawal, no fighting retreat. When the Japanese came, Paige and his Marines would fight here until they won or died. Those were the only 2 options. Ditta left at 1930 hours. Paige gathered his squad leaders. Corporal John Totman, age 25, from Oregon. Corporal Leroy Hunt, age 23, from Texas. Private First Class Gaston, now acting corporal. 17 men total, but these 3 would be critical. They would control the gun positions when chaos erupted. Paige briefed them simply. The Japanese were coming. Tonight. Thousands of them. The machine guns had to keep firing no matter what. If a gunner went down, the assistant took over. If the assistant went down, someone else took over. The guns could not stop firing. Ever. That was the only rule that mattered. "What if we run out of ammo?" Hunt asked. "We won't," Paige said. "But if we do?" "Then we use bayonets. But the guns don't stop until the belts are empty." They talked about water, about barrel changes, about how to redistribute ammunition if one gun position got hit harder than others, about how to call for artillery support if the battalion fire direction center was still operational, about what to do if Paige got killed. The conversation was practical and specific. No speeches, No appeals to courage or duty, just professional soldiers discussing how to survive the next few hours. At 2200 hours, Paige sent most of his men to sleep. They would need rest for what was coming. He kept one man awake per gun position plus 2 roving sentries. The night was thick and dark. No moon. Cloud cover blocked the stars. The jungle was a wall of black vegetation 30 yards away. Anything could be moving in that darkness. Probably was. Paige sat behind gun position 3. His personal weapon was a .45 caliber pistol. 7 rounds. He'd also grabbed an M1 Garand rifle from a dead Marine the week before. 8 rounds in the internal magazine. 15 rounds total. Not much, but it was something. He field stripped the pistol by touch. Cleaned it. Reassembled it. Loaded it. Did the same with the rifle. Repetitive motion calming his mind. At 2400 hours, midnight, one of the sentries reported movement. Paige moved forward, listened, heard nothing unusual. Sent the sentry back to his position. False alarm. Maybe. Or maybe Japanese scouts probing defenses. At 100 hours, artillery started falling on Henderson Field. Japanese 75mm guns from positions in the hills. The bombardment was heavy, sustained, clearly the prelude to something bigger. Paige woke his men. They moved to fighting positions, checked weapons, loaded belts, filled water jackets, waited. At 0230 hours, Mitchell Paige heard 3,000 Japanese soldiers advancing through the jungle toward his 17 Marines. They came screaming. That's what Paige remembered most. The sound. 3,000 voices yelling "Banzai!" In the darkness, a wall of noise rolling through the jungle toward his position. It started as a distant murmur, then louder, then overwhelming. A human tsunami of screaming Japanese soldiers charging up the ridge toward Henderson Field. Paige was behind gun position 3. He pressed his eye to the rear sight. The jungle was black. No moon, no stars, just darkness and noise. The screaming grew louder, closer. Paige could hear individual voices now, officers shouting orders, soldiers chanting, equipment rattling, boots in mud. They were close, very close. Maybe 30 yards in the jungle. Hold fire, Paige called. Nobody shoots until I do. The 17 Marines waited, fingers on triggers, eyes straining into darkness. The Japanese were 10 yards inside the jungle, still invisible, still advancing. The noise was deafening. Paige's heart hammered against his ribs. His hands were slick with sweat on the machine gun grips. Then they broke from the jungle, dark shapes materializing from the black vegetation. Dozens of them, hundreds. A solid mass of screaming Japanese soldiers charging up the ridge with bayonets fixed and rifles ready. They were 20 yards away. 15 yards. 10 yards. Paige squeezed the trigger. Gun position 3 opened fire. The Browning roared. Tracers cut through the darkness like red lasers. The beaten zone swept across the advancing Japanese soldiers. Paige saw bodies falling, heard screams change from battle cries to agony. The gun traversed left, traversed right. 6-round bursts, 9-round bursts, brass casings ejected in a golden stream. The other 3 guns opened fire simultaneously. 4 machine guns, 2,000 rounds per minute combined. The ridge erupted in muzzle flashes and tracers, and the hammering roar of sustained automatic weapons fire. The beaten zones overlapped, created a wall of bullets between the jungle and the American positions. The first wave of Japanese soldiers ran into that wall and died. Paige saw a Japanese officer 20 feet away, sword raised, mouth open in a scream. Paige put a burst into his chest. The officer went down. Another soldier filled his place. Paige killed him too. Another. Another. They kept coming, climbing over bodies, screaming, firing wildly, throwing grenades. The Americans shot them all. Gun position 1 on Paige's left flank was firing in long, sustained bursts. Too long. Paige shouted at them to shorten bursts. Save ammunition. But the sound was too loud. Nobody heard. The gun kept hammering. Tracers pouring into the Japanese assault. Bodies piling up. A grenade landed 5 feet from Paige's position. He grabbed it. Threw it back. It exploded in midair above the Japanese soldiers. Shrapnel scythed through them, More fell. More came forward. The math was impossible. Every American bullet killed one Japanese soldier. But there were 3,000 Japanese soldiers and only 6,000 American bullets. The first attack lasted 4 minutes. Then the Japanese pulled back, melted into the jungle, left maybe 70 bodies on the ridge. Paige called ceasefire. The guns fell silent. The sudden quiet was shocking. Paige's ears rang. Smoke hung in the air, the smell of cordite and blood and torn earth. "Ammo check," Paige yelled. The reports came back. Gun 1 had fired 800 rounds. Gun 2, 600. Gun 3, 500. Gun 4, 700. Total, 2,800 rounds. Almost half their ammunition. Gone. In 4 minutes. Against one attack. And the Japanese were regrouping in the jungle for another assault. The second attack came at 0245 hours, 15 minutes after the first. This time the Japanese came from 2 directions. The main assault straight up the ridge, a secondary assault from the left flank, trying to overwhelm gun position 1 and roll up the American line. They came screaming again. Voices in the darkness, muzzle flashes in the jungle, hundreds of rifles firing wildly toward the American positions. Bullets snapped overhead, thudded into the mud, sparked off the machine guns. Paige ducked behind the gun shield, pressed the trigger. The Browning answered. Gun position 1 took the brunt of the flank attack. Corporal Totman was on that gun. He traversed hard left, caught the Japanese assault in enfilade, cut them down in rows. But there were too many. They kept coming. Got within 10 yards, 8 yards. Totman never stopped firing. His assistant gunner, Private McNabb, age 20, from Montana, fed belts and cleared jams and kept the gun running. A Japanese soldier made it to within 5 yards of gun position 1. He raised his rifle, aimed at Totman. Private Gaston, in a foxhole between positions, shot the soldier 3 times with his M1 Garand. The soldier fell. Another took his place. Gaston shot him too. Then another. Gaston's rifle clicked empty. He reloaded, kept firing, protecting Totman's flank while Totman's gun killed the main assault. Paige's gun was firing almost continuously now. Short bursts had given way to longer sustained fire. The Japanese were too close. Too many. There was no time for fire discipline. Paige held the trigger, traversed the gun, watched tracers tear into human bodies, watched men die by the dozen. Felt nothing, just focused on the next target, the next burst, the next second of survival. A bullet hit the water jacket on gun position 3. Water sprayed out. Paige felt it on his face. Cold. The gun kept firing, but the water level was dropping. The barrel would overheat soon. Start glowing, maybe rupture. Paige had maybe 5 minutes before the gun failed. Private First Class Victor Stambuk, age 22, from Ohio, crawled forward with a canteen. He dumped water into the jacket. It wasn't much, maybe a quart, but it bought time. Stambuk crawled back to his foxhole, grabbed another canteen, crawled forward again. A Japanese bullet caught him in the shoulder. He dropped the canteen, kept crawling, made it to the gun, poured water, crawled back, collapsed in his foxhole. The second attack broke after 6 minutes. The Japanese withdrew, left another 100 bodies. The Americans had fired 1,500 more rounds. Total ammunition remaining, less than 2,000 rounds. 4 guns, 500 rounds each, maybe 2 more attacks. 3 if they were lucky and disciplined. Paige ran to gun position 1. Checked on Totman. Totman was alive, bleeding from a facial wound where a bullet had grazed his cheek. But alive. The gun was functional. McNabb was dead. A stray round had hit him in the throat. He'd bled out in seconds. They pulled his body from the gun pit. Private Hancock from position 4 moved up to take his place. "You good?" Paige asked Totman. Totman spit blood. "Yeah. Your gun took most of that attack. They're targeting you." "I know. Next time they'll hit you harder." "I know." Totman reloaded the gun, checked the headspace, filled the water jacket. He moved like an automaton. Mechanical, efficient. The blood on his face was black in the darkness. His hands shook slightly, but the gun was ready. The third attack came at 0310 hours, The Japanese had learned. No more screaming charges. This time they came quiet, crawling through the grass, using dead ground, trying to get close before the machine guns could engage. Paige heard them rustling, saw grass moving, called out range estimates to his gunners. 30 yards, 25 yards, 20 yards. At 15 yards the Japanese sprang up, charged. The machine guns opened fire, point-blank range. The killing was mechanical, surgical, every bullet hit. Every burst killed. The Japanese soldiers fell in heaps, but they kept coming, stepped over bodies, kept charging, reached within 10 yards, 5 yards. A Japanese soldier made it to gun position 2, Corporal Hunt's position. The soldier swung his rifle like a club, hit Hunt in the head. Hunt went down. The soldier raised his rifle to finish him. Private First Class Kelly Gates, age 19, from Louisiana, shot the soldier with his pistol. 3 rounds, center mass. The soldier fell backward. Gates grabbed the machine gun, started firing. He'd never been trained as a gunner. He'd been a rifleman, but he grabbed the gun and held the trigger and swept it across the approaching Japanese soldiers. The gun hammered. Tracers flew wild. Gates had no idea how to aim, no idea how to traverse properly. But at 5 yards, it didn't matter. The bullets found targets. Men died. Hunt regained consciousness, took the gun back from Gates. They fought together. Hunt firing, Gates loading. The gun never stopped, never even slowed. The barrel glowed red in the darkness. The water jacket boiled. Steam rose, but the gun kept working, kept killing. Paige's gun ran dry. The belt ended. He grabbed another belt, loaded it, firing again within 3 seconds. But those 3 seconds had let a Japanese soldier get close. Within 3 yards, the soldier threw a grenade. It landed in the gun pit. Paige grabbed it. No time to throw it. He pressed it against the mud wall of the pit, covered it with his body, waited for death. The grenade was a dud. It didn't explode. Paige stared at it for half a second, then grabbed his pistol, shot the Japanese soldier who'd thrown it, went back to the machine gun, started firing again. His hands moved automatically, brain disconnected, operating on pure training and adrenaline and the fundamental refusal to die. Gun position 4 went silent. Paige looked left, saw the gun was jammed. Private Pettyjohn, age 21, from Arkansas, was trying to clear it. Couldn't. The feed mechanism was broken. The gun was dead. That left 3 guns. A third of the defensive firepower gone. The Japanese sensed it, shifted their attack toward position 4. Started to exploit the gap. Paige grabbed his rifle, ran toward position 4, fired from the hip as he ran, killed 2 Japanese soldiers at 5 yards, reached the gun position, found Pettyjohn dead, a bayonet in his chest, 2 dead Japanese soldiers in the pit with him. Paige grabbed the dead gun, checked it. The feed pall was sheared off, unfixable. He abandoned it, grabbed Pettyjohn's rifle and ammunition, ran back to position 3. The third attack broke at 0320 hours. 10 minutes of sustained combat. The Japanese pulled back, left maybe 150 bodies. The Americans had fired most of their remaining ammunition, maybe 400 rounds left. Total, across 3 functional guns. Paige did quick math. 1 gun destroyed. 1 man dead at that position. 3 men wounded, 2 seriously. That left 14 Marines. 400 rounds. 3 guns, and the Japanese were regrouping for another attack. Maybe their 4th, maybe their 5th. It didn't matter. The numbers were clear. The Americans were out of ammunition, out of time, out of luck. The machine guns had killed maybe 300 Japanese soldiers. Impossible odds had become merely terrible odds. 3,000 enemies reduced to 2,700. But 2,700 was still 2,700. And the Americans had 400 bullets left. Paige looked at his men. They looked back. Faces black with gunpowder and mud and blood. Eyes wide with exhaustion and fear and something else. Determination. Absolute refusal to quit. They'd held for an hour. Killed hundreds. Lost almost nothing. Done the impossible. Now they had to do it again. At 0335 hours, during the lull between attacks, something extraordinary happened. Private First Class Joseph Connor, age 20, from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, stumbled out of the jungle into Paige's position. Connor had been with a listening post 300 yards forward. The Japanese attack had overrun his position. Everyone else was dead. Connor had hidden in the jungle for an hour, waited for a break in the Japanese lines, then ran. He was carrying 4 belts of machine gun ammunition, 200 rounds. He'd carried them while hiding, while running, while Japanese soldiers searched the jungle 20 feet away. He collapsed in Paige's pit and handed over the belts like they were made of gold. Which they were. "Thought you might need these," Connor gasped. Paige could have kissed him. 200 rounds meant another attack, maybe 2. It meant survival for another 20 minutes. He distributed the ammunition immediately, 50 rounds per gun, then put Connor on gun position 4 with Pettyjohn's rifle. The machine gun was destroyed, but Connor could provide rifle fire to protect the flank. At 0345 hours, the 4th Japanese attack began. But something had changed. The attacks were less coordinated, less aggressive. The Japanese soldiers were still coming, still fighting, but they weren't charging with the same fanatical determination. They were taking cover, crawling forward, taking their time. They'd lost hundreds of men in the previous attacks. The survivors were thinking now, calculating, realizing that the ridge was killing them. The Americans used this, fired carefully, made every round count, 6-round bursts, 9-round bursts, only at visible targets, no suppressive fire, no wasted ammunition, pure precision shooting. The machine guns became sniper rifles. Each burst killed 1 soldier, sometimes 2. The Japanese advance slowed, stopped, withdrew. They came again at 0410 hours, again at 0445 hours, again at 0520 hours. Each attack was weaker than the last. Fewer soldiers, less coordination, more confusion. The Americans were down to their last ammunition belt, maybe 100 rounds total. But they were still firing, still killing, still holding. At 0530 hours, dawn started breaking. Gray light filtered through the jungle. Paige could see for the first time. What he saw shocked him. Bodies everywhere. Hundreds of bodies, piled in heaps, scattered across the ridge. Japanese soldiers dead in every imaginable position. Crawling, running, kneeling. Some looked peaceful. Most didn't. The ridge was carpeted with death. 6 American observation pilots watched from altitude. They'd been circling since 0300 hours, trying to assess the situation, trying to call in artillery support. But the Japanese attack was too close to the American positions. Artillery would kill Marines as easily as Japanese. So the pilots had watched, helpless, frustrated. Now, as dawn broke, they saw the full scope of what had happened. 4 machine gun positions, less than 20 Marines, surrounded by hundreds of dead Japanese soldiers. The pilots couldn't believe it. They radioed division headquarters, reported the situation, used words like unbelievable and impossible, and they're still fighting. Major General Alexander Vandegrift, commanding the 1st Marine Division, heard the reports. He'd been awake all night coordinating the defense. Multiple Japanese attacks across the entire perimeter. Most had been repelled. Some had broken through. The situation was chaotic and desperate. But this ridge, Paige's Ridge, had held completely. Not one Japanese soldier had gotten past those machine guns. Vandegrift ordered fresh troops forward, sent a company from the reserve battalion. They arrived at 600 hours, found Paige and 13 Marines still fighting. 4 more had been wounded in the later attacks. 2 had died. But the machine guns were still firing. The position still held. The Japanese perspective told a different story. Colonel Toshinari Shoji commanded the 29th Infantry Regiment. His mission was simple: break through the American lines and capture Henderson Field. He had 3,000 soldiers. The Americans had maybe a few hundred defending this sector. The math was obvious. Overwhelming force against a thin defensive line. Victory was certain. The first attack should have worked. 1,000 soldiers charging uphill with bayonets and grenades and absolute conviction. But the machine guns had stopped them. Cut them down like wheat. Killed 70 men in 4 minutes. Shoji couldn't understand it. Where were all the Americans? How many machine guns did they have? The fire was coming from only 4 positions, but it was devastating. Coordinated, professional, deadly. He ordered a second attack, 2 assault groups, main effort up the ridge, supporting effort against the flank, 2,000 soldiers total. Surely enough to overwhelm 4 machine gun positions, but the second attack failed too. More dead. Maybe 150. The machine guns never stopped firing. Every approach was covered. Every gap was protected. It was impossible. Shoji was losing men faster than he could count. His regiment was being destroyed. After the third attack failed, his battalion commanders reported their men were refusing to advance. Not from cowardice. From mathematics. They'd seen 300 soldiers charge up that ridge. Seen 10 come back. The ratio was unsustainable. The Americans had created a killing zone that no amount of courage could cross. A captured American prisoner, wounded and delirious, told Japanese interrogators that only 18 Marines were defending the ridge. 18. The interrogators didn't believe it. They beat the prisoner thinking he was lying. But he kept saying 18. 18 Marines. 4 machine guns. That's all. The interrogators reported this to Shoji. He didn't believe it either. But it explained the narrow frontage of American fire, the concentration of defensive positions. Shoji made a decision. He would bypass this ridge, move his remaining soldiers around the flanks, let someone else deal with these 18 invincible Marines. But it was too late. Dawn was breaking. American aircraft would soon be overhead. His regiment needed to be hidden in the jungle before the planes arrived. He ordered a general withdrawal. The Japanese soldiers pulled back, carried their wounded, left their dead, melted into the jungle. They were veterans from China. They'd fought in Shanghai and Nanking and a dozen other battles. They'd never been stopped like this, never been defeated by such a small force. It violated everything they understood about combat. Word spread through the Japanese forces on Guadalcanal. 18 starving Marines had held a ridge against 3,000 soldiers, had killed hundreds, had broken multiple battalion-strength assaults. The story seemed impossible, but the bodies proved it. The survivors confirmed it. Shoji's regiment had been shattered by 18 men. Japanese commanders began reassessing their intelligence. If 18 Marines could do this, what could 100 do? What could 1,000 do? Maybe the Americans on Guadalcanal weren't as weak as intelligence suggested. Maybe the starvation and disease hadn't broken them. Maybe these Marines were more dangerous than anyone had calculated. The psychological impact was profound. Japanese soldiers who'd never feared Americans before now hesitated, thought twice before attacking, wondered if the next ridge held another Sergeant Paige with another 4 machine guns. The myth of invincibility was cracking, being replaced by doubt. On the American side, the opposite happened. Word spread quickly. Paige's stand became legendary within hours. Other units heard the story. 18 Marines. 4 machine guns. Thousands of Japanese dead. It became a rallying cry. Proof that Marines could win against impossible odds. That courage and discipline and good tactics could overcome any numerical disadvantage. Pilots flying out of Henderson Field painted small Japanese flags on their aircraft for every enemy plane shot down. Now ground troops started painting small flags for confirmed kills. Paige's section painted hundreds of flags on their destroyed machine guns. The guns became shrines, physical proof that ordinary Marines could do extraordinary things. The battle on Paige's Ridge changed nothing strategically. Henderson Field was still vulnerable. The Japanese still outnumbered the Americans. Supplies were still scarce. Disease was still rampant. But something had shifted psychologically. The Japanese knew they could lose. The Americans knew they could win. At 0700 hours on October 26, 1942, the relief company reached Paige's position. Captain Ditta was with them. He'd spent the night expecting to find bodies. Instead, he found Mitchell Paige sitting behind his machine gun, smoking a captured Japanese cigarette, surrounded by hundreds of enemy dead. 13 Marines were still alive. 4 were wounded but functional. The machine guns had fired every round of ammunition. The barrels were ruined from heat. The mechanisms were fouled with carbon. But they'd worked. They'd worked all night. Ditta couldn't speak. He just stared. At the bodies. At the exhausted Marines. At Paige, who looked like he'd aged 10 years in 8 hours. Finally Ditta found words. "Jesus Christ, Mitch, what did you do?" Paige shrugged. "Held the line, sir." They counted bodies later. Found 312 confirmed dead Japanese soldiers within 100 yards of the American positions. Another 100 or so further back. Call it 400 dead, maybe more. The exact count didn't matter. What mattered was the ratio. 18 Marines had stopped 3,000 soldiers, had killed 400, had broken multiple regimental strength assaults, had saved Henderson Field. Marine Corps headquarters sent a photographer to document the scene. He took pictures of the bodies, the destroyed machine guns, the exhausted Marines. The photos were shocking. Piles of dead soldiers, weapons scattered everywhere, blood-soaked ground, evidence of a battle that shouldn't have been survivable. The 1st Marine Division historian interviewed Paige 2 days later, asked him to explain how he'd held. Paige didn't have a good answer. He talked about fields of fire, about ammunition discipline, about the courage of his men. But he couldn't explain how 17 starving Marines had defeated 3,000 soldiers. It was mathematically impossible. But they'd done it anyway. Major General Vandegrift recommended Paige for the Medal of Honor. The citation was written quickly, approved rapidly. Usually medals took months to process. This one took weeks. The Marine Corps needed heroes, needed proof that Marines were winning. Paige became that proof. On May 21, 1943, 7 months after the battle, President Franklin Roosevelt presented the Medal of Honor to Sergeant Mitchell Paige at a ceremony in Washington, D.C. Paige wore his dress blues. Roosevelt read the citation. It described the battle in clinical terms. Single-handedly maintained his position, defended it against overwhelming numbers, and held the line. The words didn't capture the reality, couldn't capture what it felt like to fire a machine gun for 8 hours straight, while thousands of enemy soldiers tried to kill you. But they were official, permanent. Recognition that something extraordinary had happened. Paige was promoted to platoon sergeant, then technical sergeant, then lieutenant. He spent the rest of the war training machine gun crews, teaching them what he'd learned on that ridge. Fire discipline, fields of fire, how to maintain weapons under impossible conditions. Hundreds of Marines learned from him. Those Marines went to Tarawa and Saipan and Iwo Jima. They used Paige's tactics, saved lives with his lessons. Of the 13 Marines who survived the battle, 11 survived the war. Corporal Totman died at Tarawa in November 1943. Private Gaston died at Peleliu in September 1944. The others went home, got married, had children, worked ordinary jobs. Most never talked about Guadalcanal. It was too big, too overwhelming. How do you explain to civilians what it felt like to fight for 14 hours against 3,000 enemy soldiers with only 4 machine guns? The Japanese 29th Infantry Regiment was withdrawn from Guadalcanal in November 1942. Of the 3,000 soldiers who'd attacked Henderson Field on October 26th, fewer than 800 were fit for duty by month's end. Disease and starvation and combat had destroyed the rest. The regiment was rebuilt in New Guinea, sent to the Philippines in 1944. Destroyed again at Leyte, reformed, destroyed at Okinawa. By war's end, the 29th Infantry Regiment existed only on paper. The physical unit had been annihilated 3 times over. Colonel Shoji survived the war. He spent 20 years trying to understand what had happened on that ridge, how 18 Marines had stopped his regiment. He studied American tactics, read after-action reports, interviewed survivors. His conclusion was simple. American machine gunners were the finest in the world, better trained, better disciplined, better equipped, and when led by someone like Mitchell Paige, they were unbeatable. Shoji wrote a memoir in 1965, dedicated a chapter to the battle, called it The Night of the Ghost Guns. He never learned Paige's name, just knew him as the American sergeant who held the ridge. Henderson Field remained in American hands for the rest of the war. The Japanese never came that close again. Supplies improved. Reinforcements arrived. Disease was controlled. By December 1942, Guadalcanal was secure. the strategic turning point in the Pacific War, and it hinged on multiple desperate actions, including one night when 18 starving Marines with 4 machine guns held a ridge against impossible odds. Mitchell Paige returned to Pennsylvania after the war, married his high school sweetheart Marilyn, had 3 children, worked as a rancher in California, later became a motivational speaker, traveled the country talking about leadership and courage and what it meant to serve. He never bragged about Guadalcanal, never claimed to be special. When people asked about the battle, he always said the same thing. "I had good men. They did the work." Every October 26th, Paige called the survivors of his section. Totman and Gaston were dead, but the others were alive, scattered across America. Farmers and teachers and factory workers. They'd talk for hours. Remember the men who died. Remember the machine guns that saved their lives. Remember what it felt like to survive something impossible. The calls continued for 40 years. Even when Paige was old and sick, he made the calls, kept the connection alive, honored the memory of that night. In 1985, a Marine Corps historian named John Smith tracked down Paige. Wanted to do a detailed study of the battle. Smith had access to Japanese records, could finally tell the full story. He interviewed Paige for 30 hours, recorded everything, then spent 5 years verifying details through Japanese archives and survivor accounts. His final report estimated that Paige's section had held off between 2,800 and 3,100 Japanese soldiers, had killed between 380 and 420, had done it with 18 Marines and 6,000 rounds of ammunition. The ratio was staggering: 1 American for every 150 attackers, 1 bullet for every 8 to 10 enemy soldiers killed or repulsed. The most efficient defensive action in Marine Corps history, possibly in American military history. Smith's report became required reading at infantry officer schools. Paige's tactics were studied and copied. His decision-making was analyzed. His leadership was praised. He became a case study in how to win the unwinnable fight. Paige died on November 15, 2003. He was 85 years old. His funeral was held at Arlington National Cemetery. Full military honors. Hundreds of Marines attended. Many had never met him, came just to honor what he represented. Ordinary Americans doing extraordinary things when everything depended on it. That's how innovation actually happens in war. Not through brilliant generals or perfect planning or overwhelming resources. Through sergeants and corporals who see problems and find solutions and refuse to quit when mathematics says they should. Through men like Mitchell Paige, who held a ridge because someone had to, who fired machine guns until the barrels glowed because there was no other option, who saved Henderson Field and possibly the entire Guadalcanal campaign, because 18 Marines decided that impossible odds just meant you had to try harder. Each one matters. Each one deserves to be remembered. If you found this story compelling, please like, subscribe to stay connected. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. Thank you for keeping these stories alive.